Hi everyone, this is Chapter 6, Television and Cable and the Power of the Visual Culture. As you can see on the opening slide, that's the picture of President Kennedy and later President Nixon in their national debate. And we'll talk about that when we come to the part on how the visual image made the difference. Okay, this is a quote from the Institute for the Future back in 2005, but I think it holds true. And he says that no old media form or no old medium ever disappears. They're just reinvented into a new purpose. TV, that was 2005. TV has certainly gone through this reinvention now. It is transforming all the time, and predominantly due to cable and due to advancing technologies. I put in this slide because I had to have a slide in here about the development of television. But I tell you right now, I don't have anything on the quiz about Philo Farnsworth, but it's an interesting background if you're interested in it, and there is the development of the television there. So I'm just going to keep going. Really, the period that we're most interested in comes in the 50s, and that's when television as popular culture, when it had influence on society, and that's when it became readily available to people. And of course, everyone knows this iconic image. That is, of course, I Love Lucy and her both on-screen and real-life husband, Desi Arnaz. Okay, so that was considered the really the golden age of television, when in the 50s, yes, it had just begun really in the popular sense. People were just getting televisions in their homes, and they were transforming from the nights when they were gathered around the radio to hear Franklin Roosevelt during the war years, and now they had a television to gather around, and they had images to watch instead of just a radio. So through that period, of course, television had explosive growth because, everyone wanted TV. And this was the era of a lot of variety shows, including Ed Sullivan. And let's see if this will come up here. Okay, I'm not going to get my link to work, it looks like. But Ed Sullivan was a variety show, and you see a picture of him here down at the bottom, a variety show host, and he had Elvis Presley on, and who he famously had taped from the waist up because of that ever so provocative hip swivel he did. Can you imagine? The hip swivel was considered provocative in the 50s. And he had the Rolling Stones on. This was, well, actually in the 60s, of course, he had the Rolling Stones on. And, he had the same kind of issue with them, wanted them to change the language. They went ahead and did it anyway. But that was the variety show of that era. That era also included sponsors, and you'll read about all of this in your text, where you're going to get more information than you do here just from this little bit that I'm telling you about it. But there would be one sponsor for an entire show instead of, I don't know, what is it, 6 or 7 or 8 or maybe 10 commercials at each commercial break in the shows today. If any of you even watch television shows anymore on regular TV and not through Hulu or something. But then there would be one sponsor, and that sponsor would continue through the show. Colgate, Comedy Hour, there was Kraft, GE, General Electric, and then another sponsor called Geritol, which you don't even really hear about anymore. But Geritol was the sponsor for this show, the quiz show. It was called 21, and what happened was essentially Geritol was the sponsor, and so it wanted to control the content, and of course the producers didn't want that, but these were the guys who were paying the bills, the sponsors were. And what happened was you see the picture of the Life magazine with the picture of the a professor, an Ivy League professor, and he was quite attractive by the standards in those years, and everyone really liked him and wanted him to continue to win. Well, he had a challenger in who was a little, less appealing, Herb Semple, but very, very bright. And so he actually, anyway, so what happened was the producers ended up feeding answers to Van Doren, who was the college professor and the nice-looking guy, to get him to stay on. And Herb Semple, he wasn't having any of that, and he suspected it, and so he reported a fraud. And what happened was that it eventually led to congressional hearings over how quiz shows were handled, and led to the end of the complete show sponsors, the one sponsor show. That was the quiz show scandal. And there's a movie called The Quiz Show, I think it's called, Quiz Show. It's really good. I recommend it. Okay, so this era, that was more the 50s and 60s. Then in the 60s came really the era of the broadcast news. They were on in the 50s too, but these were the broadcast news era, and there were the big three, NBC, ABC, and CBS. And CBS had Walter Cronkite, who was voted the most trusted man in America by, well, not voted, but it was a poll. I believe it was a Gallup poll. And that's how people thought of their newscasters then. There was Chet Huntley and David Brinkley on NBC, and Harry Reasoner on ABC, I believe it was. So the network news shows dominated until about 1980 and the advent of cable. And here's just a couple of pictures from some of the longest running shows on network television. There was Gunsmoke, which ran for 20 years, and that was the longest. It was a Western, and Matt Dillon was the sheriff, and Kitty was she ran a saloon. I don't even know, maybe it was a brothel, and she had the heart of gold, but he never did marry her, so who knows what was going on. And then, of course, came the Fox network, and with its Simpsons debut in 1989, The Simpsons became the longest running show on television, and that's a picture there of creator Matt Groening. And The Simpsons, we talked a little about The Simpsons and some of South Park when we talked about high and low culture and mass communications. Simpsons is one of those shows that's definitely got some low culture aspects to it, but has some great social satire. Okay, so talking for a minute about the downsides, the disadvantages, the not so cool stuff that happened with the advent of television, and one of those was racism on television. In the 60s, there was very little exposure for any African Americans on television, and if it was, the roles were very stereotypical and very limiting and limited. In this variety show, Petula Clark, who was a singer at the time, she introduced Harry Belafonte, who was this wonderful singer, very talented man. And so when she talked to him on this variety show on television, on the air, she actually, well, you can see in the picture there, she touched his arm. And that alone became a scandal because a white woman was touching a black man on national television. Well, I don't, that's a pretty incredible turn of events, in my opinion, that people were upset about that. But that was the era, and there were very few African Americans at all on television. So this was a moment in TV. Well, here's some other kind of downsides, as I see it, to television, cable, and visual culture. And one of them is inane shows like Duck Dynasty and Here Comes Honey Boo Boo, and even the Kardashian shows, in my opinion, but those are, the Kardashian shows made the top 10 list that we're going to see a little bit later. But what I'm trying to say here is that there's a lot on television and cable that is pretty inane, and some of it is even on the television, on the cable news shows, where they have these huge 24-hour news cycles. Imagine when they used to have the news on for 30 minutes or maybe 3 or 4 times a day for 30 minutes, and now these cable are 24 hours and they have to come up with new content. So you can just imagine what happens. Stories that aren't really news stories get blown up bigger than they really should be, or they get dragged out, or you see Nancy Grace drag somebody on to interview and make a huge issue out of very little. So to me, that's some of the downside, the banality, the often the sexual content and the sexual and racial stereotyping. A lot of the reality TV, and there are people out there who still believe that reality TV isn't scripted. And of course, we know that yes, they don't write out scripts for them to read like they would on a sitcom or something, but that they definitely have to follow a certain line, a certain plot line. We also know that one of the reasons that reality shows are more popular and have proliferated is that, yes, they gather a big audience, but the thing that they also do is they're cheap. You don't have to pay a lot of actors, right? Script writers are minimal, and it's very, very cost effective. Okay, another one of the, now I'm going to move it for a minute to the upside of television. And one of the upsides of television is certainly that it's entertaining. It just gives us some kind of diversion, something to do so that we aren't, just something to take us away from our normal life, really, to entertain us. Like Saturday Night Live, and that's Justin Timberlake in that scene. And then it also can inform us with news, of course, like we talked about the broadcast news. And then it can entertain us, like with The Daily Show. So there's a lot of good things about television as well. Another one of the upsides of the visual culture was that it brings, and still does and did then, images into the living room, so that in this case, this was the McCarthy hearings in the 1950s. And this was a senator. He was the anti-communist. I was looking for a word that didn't sound too pejorative there, but anyway, he was an avid anti-communist, and he essentially created this committee, House on Un-American Activities, known as HUAC, and called people before the committee to testify on whether or not they'd ever known or been associated with or a communist or been to a communist meeting. And, some people, in the 30s and 40s, that was considered kind of the in thing to do, to explore communism. It didn't mean that they were traitors to our country, but according to Joseph McCarthy, you were indeed. If you'd ever known or ever done anything, had anything to do with communism, then you were a traitor to the country. Now, in one of the things that Edward R. Murrow says in his broadcast about Joseph McCarthy is that he admonishes people to not confuse dissent with disloyalty. Because remember, that's part of what our First Amendment guarantees us. It's the right to dissent. We can even petition our government for redress of grievances. We can speak against our government and against our elected officials if we don't like them. And then we advocate for change through our election process. And we can be a member of any party that we want as long as it's not advocating the violent overthrow of the government. That's part of our First Amendment rights. But here it was in the 1950s, so the not that distant past, when the senator was kind of, running amok, I think is what the history books show, and ruining people's careers and calling them before the House. and Edward R. Murrow on television as a commentator and a news guy was one of the people who helped kind of stop McCarthy. So that's, again, an aspect of one of the good sides of visual culture. The other thing, and here I've got links embedded here, so when I upload this PowerPoint to our site, you can just click on the links and they'll work for you then. If I show them all now, this lecture will go on forever, so I'm going to leave that for you to do, but I think you'll enjoy them. And here's another positive aspect, in my opinion, of the television and the visual culture, and that was how it brought these images of the 60s and the protests and the civil rights movement into living rooms. You know, yes, they were on the front pages of newspapers too, so people saw the stories and the still images as well. But it's quite a moving experience to see the actual video of somebody hitting peaceful protesters, or seeing these, you know, peaceful people and men, women, and children blasted with fire hoses just to get them to stop, and all the national or the state guard standing there preventing a young black woman from going into a high school. And then once Eisenhower ordered the U.S. National Guard to allow them, then the Guard escorted these kids to high school, if you can imagine that. But that's something that partly helped to bring about social change was television and these images coming into people's living room. And the same held true actually with the Vietnam War. I think I've got a slide of that in just a second. Well, maybe I don't. Yeah, I don't know. Anyway, with the Vietnam War, because they saw night after night more flag-draped coffins, they saw the war, and Walter Cronkite, who I mentioned earlier as a broadcast journalist, was one of the people who was there covering Vietnam. And one of the things that he did during the course of his coverage, you know, he was there on the ground as a reporter, and after he'd covered it for a few years, he came on the air and did commentary. So remember how we talked about news needs to be objective, and if you're a news reporter, you're an observer. Well, that's what he was all those years. But then when after he'd covered it for so long, he came on the air and said, you know, in this reporter's opinion. So he made it clear that this was an opinion piece. It was no longer news reporting, but he said in this reporter's opinion, this war is unwinnable and doesn't take away from the valor of our troops, but we need to leave. And so it was a very influential moment. And Lyndon Johnson, who was the president at the time, is quoted as having said, well, if I've lost Cronkite, I've lost the country. And of course, you know the history. He didn't run for a second term after that. Okay, and here's how it also shapes politics, in addition to what I was just talking about, is this was from the same debate that you saw in the first slide. And I think this is pretty famous now, but Kennedy was this kind of erudite young Easterner, came from money. His dad was part of the Industrial Revolution and actually made a lot of money in industry before there were child labor laws, frankly. But anyway, the Kennedy dynasty was even well known then. And he was, you know, very well dressed and very relaxed. And you can see just from this picture how then sitting Vice President Richard Nixon wasn't so relaxed and wasn't comfortable in front of the cameras in this new medium. And he actually had injured his knee the day before, and he bumped it right before he came in, and so he was, you know, in a substantial amount of pain. And he declined the makeup that was offered to him, which Kennedy accepted. And he's kind of a nervous guy anyway, and he sweat a lot, and he kind of has small brown eyes, and he kind of darted them around. And at the end of the day, people thought that when they watched it on television, they thought that Kennedy won the debate. When they heard it on the radio, they thought Nixon won. So that's pretty good evidence of the power of visual culture right there. And then, of course, the slide on the right is the sad day when President Kennedy was assassinated. And that was in Dallas right before the bullet. Okay. Now, I mentioned this political impact because 50 years later, during the 2012 Republican primary, remember, to decide who was going to run against President Obama in 2012. This was Rick Perry and Ron Paul. And if you haven't seen this before, you should watch it, because Rick Perry was this rising star. He's the governor, still the governor of Texas. And, you know, he's a nice-looking man and seemed to be well-spoken. He's conservative, so he had those credentials. But when he got on television for the national debate, he couldn't remember. He said he was going to close down 3 different agencies, and he couldn't remember them on national television. And in this video clip, Ron Paul tries to help him, actually. It was a very awkward moment, and that really did pretty much end his campaign right there. So here's another question for you on visual culture and its power. The appearance and their speeches of the candidates' wives and what they wear, does that make a difference? Do people vote for a candidate based on what their spouses are like? Who knows? When Bill Clinton was running for president in the Central Valley, I remember traveling through the Central Valley, which is down, you know, Fresno area, down off the 99 and the 5, and there would be signs that would say, or I guess after Clinton was already president, and they'd say, "Impeach Hillary," and the idea that she was such a, you know, a too strong woman or too shrill or something like that, a little sexist, but that they just thought she had too much power in the presidency. Okay, and then, you know, the question is, did it make a difference? So there's another link that you can look at later. Okay, so moving back to now out of politics and into cultural impressions. This is a scene from All in the Family, which ran in the 70s, and it was a type of a situation comedy, but always with social commentary. And Edith plays the fool here a little bit, but she was actually, you know, she had the bigger heart. Well, Archie has a big heart too. Anyway, Archie was an overt bigot, and maybe Edith plays the foil, I guess. But you should watch it just to see the clip there that I set up, because it's very interesting how this content was considered so taboo, and yet it was so widely embraced. It was a Norman Lear production, widely embraced during the 70s, even though, you know, it was the first time many of those topics had been broached on national television. And here's more social impact. There's the war pictures that I was looking for. And the top picture is, of course, coffins. The bottom picture is the little girl running with napalm on her back. She's burning, actually. So it's a pretty horrid image. And imagine that image comes into your living room, and the first thing you think is, you know, we should not be involved in anything like that. And so that was one of the effects that ended up precipitating the end of the Vietnam War, at least the end of the U.S. involvement in it. Okay, and then here's just a slide about our move to digital, and how it was actually very recent, 2007, at least that's recent for me, 6 years, I guess, for most of our audience here. That's quite a little time ago. But it became law in 2009 that all television sets had to be set up to receive a digital signal. Okay, so back on television, here are some of the top viewed TV shows of 2012. So it's got football, an ABC, one of the, you know, an ABC comedy, another CBS, and NBC, so I guess it looks like a football rain on NBC. But you can see the rest of the shows, and then there's Fox in there too with Seth MacFarlane's Family Guy. and of course some reality shows. This is just so you know about Nielsen ratings and how they work. Essentially, the bigger the rating, which means the more people are watching your show, the more you can charge for advertising. So it's very logical. If you only have 200,000 people watching your show, you're not going to be able to charge very much to run an ad on that show. If on the other hand you've got 1.5 million people watching every night, well then you're going to be able to charge some big bucks for your advertising and people will want it. And it's based on how many sets of eyes see it, just like it is for newspapers and magazines and any other kind of advertising. The advertiser pays based on how many eyes of their desired demographic, their target demographic, sees the show. Okay, so this is just looking at some advertising revenue in to see how it, let's see, I think it was 2000, the blue, the longer one, the television, so that was in 2001 season. You can see that the networks made a lot more money from advertising than they per show than they could in 2011. And you see which ones are the big ones. American Idol, which surprises me. I didn't even know that was still that big. But there you go. And Family Guy again, Glee. Okay, and then there came the breakdown of the network dominance. And how did that happen? Well, some of it happened because of the advent of cable, which offered specialized shows. It offered, hundreds of channels, and it had sports, this nonstop sports on ESPN and some of the other sports channels, specific soccer channels you can watch. Well, you guys know. Watch soccer all day long if you want to. There were also like the Ted Turner Superstation, which started out being all movies. And then the other thing that really affected broadcast was the advent of the VCR. Now the VCR was like the DVR today, which is connected to your cable service, but the VCR was a separate thing that you bought, and it had those big cassettes, and you could just set it to just like the DVR really, but you had to record onto a tape, and so no longer did you have to sit through commercials. Well, you can just imagine if people are not sitting through the commercials and they're recording and watching it later in what's called time shifting, then you can just watch your show whenever you want and fast forward through the commercials. Well, if nobody's watching the commercials, why should the advertisers pay for them? So that's been a long-standing problem for television. Okay, and then here's how cable developed. Now, cable goes back as far as TV does, really, but here's how it started. It was devised by these appliance store dealers and electronic firms back in the 40s, and the reason was that they wanted to get TV programming out to the rural areas so that they could sell the appliances. It's kind of ironic, but that's how it got started. Okay, and then there were some key key cable developments that really ended up harming broadcast. And of course, those were, as I mentioned, the DVRs, preceded by the VCRs. And again, time shifting. Then there's the rise of the infotainment shows, all these, The View, maybe The Voice. I don't know if that's really considered infotainment, because it's really not, because it's a contest like American Idol. And then satire and fake news like The Daily Show and The Colbert Show. And then how else did they come to such popularity and such huge saturation of the market? And part of that is that they just developed shows without, they developed shows that people wanted. Now originally cable stations were just there they were called common carriers, and they were just there to deliver television content. But then they started developing their own shows, and here's just a list of some of the popular ones. I put Simpsons on there, and that's an error because that's not cable, that's Fox, which is a network, which is broadcast. But these other ones are just popular shows that people like that come up to us through cable. And when you start delivering content that people want, well, then you get success. And then here's Colbert and on the left, and Jon Stewart on the right. They both called it, well, Stewart's called his a fake news show, and Colbert's on-air persona is that he is a right-wing conservative. So just about everything he does is pretty tongue-in-cheek. But it's a great way to watch the news and to really learn about the issues of the day. Okay, so for cable shows, these are the top ad-supported shows. And why are they ad-supported? Because they got the most viewers in these age ranges. And there you have it, The Walking Dead, Jersey Shores. I was surprised that was still on there. But this is from 2012, so Sons of Anarchy and so on. Teen Mom 2, an unfortunate show in my opinion, since it has served to, anyway, I don't want to say that, but I've read some negative effects about Teen Mom, and I'd be interested to hear what people think about it. In fact, maybe it could be part of a media issue project. We'll see. Okay, and then here's some other a show on revenue from basic cable, and you can see how it looks. It just you know, the networks decline and cable kind of goes up. One of the things I want to mention is the public broadcasting system. This was created to provide an independent source of news that isn't beholden to advertisers or anybody else. But it turns out that it comes under fire whenever it does any kind of a critical piece of a sitting president. President Nixon wanted to cut its funding because he didn't like the shows that it was doing about him. And President George W. Bush did the same thing, threatened to cut its funding because he didn't like some of the coverage that he was receiving on public television. But I will say public television has some excellent journalists, and when we get to radio, you'll see public radio is much the same way, excellent in-depth journalism. This is just you can look this up about Buster and what happened under I believe it was 2005, so under the Bush administration. There was a moment in this cartoon when Buster visits these two female heads of household, and it let's see, was it the Bush administration education department? Yes, education secretary denounced PBS on Tuesday for spending public money on a cartoon with lesbian characters, saying that many parents would not want children exposed to such lifestyles. It wasn't clear that it was a lesbian lifestyle. It was to female heads of household. But anyway, what happened was the upshot is that here's a PBS show that is threatened because what they felt were the mores didn't mesh with those of the current Secretary of Education and that department's values. So PBS, and whether it's news or other programming, does come under fire, even though it was set up to be this independent programming that wasn't subject to the vagaries of advertising. And then here's some of the shows that are PBS shows, and you know that you could see why some people wouldn't want to support those. But in my opinion, public broadcasting is an important part of our part of what's on television, because they do have a lot of educational, historical, and of course their news shows. Okay, so in summary, on television and cable, they, as we saw, they provide diversion, information. They can have a profound impact on society and on culture and on politics. And we can look at them to see whether or not we think the changing we saw an image of I Love Lucy in the 50s, and in that show the man and wife didn't share a bed because that was considered too much for television viewers. And of course we see now on television that it goes way farther than that on television and even in the 9 o'clock hour. And so we've seen a lot of changes in what's acceptable on TV. And, I can ask you on this topic, as I have on many others, whether you believe that television precipitated change, or did it mirror what was already going on in society? Was it a catalyst, for instance, during the civil rights era, or was it merely showing what was already going on? And do the fictional shows, the sitcoms and things like that, do those create a new value set, or do they mirror a value set that's already in the works and in change? So I leave you with those questions, and thank you very much. That's it for television and the visual culture.